Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Remember, you can find me on social media at skeysimages and my website, skeysimages.com. Now, today we're going to talk about the topic of sharing locations in wildlife photography. I'm going to give you my opinions, list the pros and cons, and hopefully generate some discussion around it. So let's jump right in. Now, over the years, I've developed a philosophy on location sharing, and essentially, I've just stopped doing it. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm going to list 4 of the main reasons why I don't share locations anymore and why you might want to consider it yourself. Now, the first reason is pretty simple to understand. It's about the impact that it has on an individual, a species, or a group. The second one is about the impact that we have on the environment and the habitat. And the last 2 are about ourselves, about the intimacy that we have in a location when we're photographing it alone, and then lastly, the uniqueness of an image as it pertains to photography. So let's jump into that first reason, and that's about the species. Like I said, this one's pretty straightforward, so we probably don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but just know that when we enter the environment and work with a subject, we are probably having some impact on that species, whether it's an alertness or an awareness. Hopefully our presence does not change the behavior of the subject. And I think that's very important, not only for the species, it actually will help you produce better images when you're photographing subjects that are natural and doing their daily routines. While our individual presence may have a minimal impact on a subject, oftentimes groups will not. So one thing to consider is, how do we minimize our impact on the subjects that we photograph? And I think if we can do it as an individual, it's certainly best. When we advertise locations, it does entice others to show up to those same locations. And it really doesn't matter if we're photographing a fox den with kittens in it or a rare bird species. The subject that I think is of most interest to people tends to be owls. And in my community of bird photographers, these owls draw crowds. And when their locations are shared, it seems to be that everybody wants to go there. So again, an individual impact on that one owl or that group of owls may not be enough to change the behavior of that owl, that individual, or that group. But if there's a lot of people around, maybe it will. Again, I think it's a pretty easy concept to understand. As photographers, yes, we are going to have a minimal impact when we do it by ourselves. That impact can be detrimental when it becomes large groups. So number one reason not to share locations is simply to protect the individual species or the groups that we're photographing. Now let's talk about one other aspect of species that involves not just the location, but the timing. And since it's a connected topic, I'm just going to throw it in here. When you're working with a sensitive species, we often want to rush to share our joy with others. That's a part of social media. It's a component we have. We want to run home and tell our loved ones, but we also want to put it out there for all of our friends and family on Facebook. Do we have to do that right away? If I just photographed a sensitive species, am I patient enough to hang on to that for maybe a week or a month? If I post it right away, there's a good chance that other people will inquire about it. Hey, I saw you post an owl. Where'd you see it? Now, it puts you in a pretty awkward position at that point to possibly say no to your friends, or to tell your friends and ask them to keep it quiet, but now you're trusting somebody to keep a secret. And that doesn't always happen. So a friend may tell a friend who may tell more, and all of a sudden that location or that spot or that species that you were trying to protect is no longer protected. What I have found is when I work with a sensitive species, I will generally wait a few weeks or a few months. It's the same image. It's going to get the same response whether I share it today or 3 weeks from now. But what it also does is it gets people to stop asking about, hey, where did you see it? Because now the time has passed for that subject. Now, the second reason I don't share locations is to help protect the physical environment. So, for example, as I'm in the woods or working in a meadow, I know that I'm going to have some disruption to the environment. And while I try to minimize that, I think I do a pretty good job with it. I am probably going to have some impact on the environment. If I'm walking through a field or grasses and I'm stepping on things, that set of footprints can have an impact. but let's try to keep it to one set of footprints. If we go to the same locations over and over and over again, one set of footprints becomes 10, becomes 100, thousands, and sometimes 1,000 a day. So there are locations out there, and I'll show you some images now that were submitted to me by my social media followers. These are images that they experienced, scenes that they experienced, crowds of people that had gathered to photograph rarities or just congregated on an area that is well known. So the second reason about protecting the environment, I think we can do a better job when we just handle it ourselves and we don't put those locations out there to be broadcast. There is an impact that could potentially be had, especially in sensitive habitats or sensitive areas. We've also heard stories of photographers who will change or alter the environment to improve their photography. And that could be something that could be detrimental, not just to the habitat, but also to the species. So just remember that when you're considering the habitat, one set of footprints versus hundreds or thousands, always going to minimize the impact when we keep it smaller and keep those locations to ourselves. Now, the third and the fourth reasons are actually a little bit more selfish. So the third reason is the intimacy that we get when we photograph a subject or an area alone. Now, this may be only my experience, but I know there are others out there who feel like this. You show up to an area, you want to get out, you want to clear your head and get some fresh air. You want to have that moment of Zen. For me, it is my meditation and my yoga. And I get to my destination and there's another car or a group of cars, or there's a group of people. And instantly something triggers in me and I just don't feel the same anymore. Conversely, when I'm in a quiet area alone and just working with a subject by myself, it feels intimate and it feels special and I cherish it. I really value that time spent. And when we share locations, we risk jeopardizing that. We risk having other people brought to areas that were once our peaceful spots, our moments of solace, are no longer quiet because they've become popular. And maybe not popular with everybody, but it could become popular with groups of photographers who now have adopted the same locations to do their work in. So it is something to consider. Is it a little selfish? Maybe it is. But I think it's something to be considered. And it's something that I consider when I'm sharing my locations as well. Now, the last part of sharing locations, I think, has to do with the photography itself. And this is about the uniqueness that is often created when you find a great location. And let me be very clear about this. I think great photography for wildlife is not about the species. It is about the complete scene that we create, the mood that we invoke. And those locations that have great light or great perspective or great backgrounds or great habitat, they're not easy to come by. And when you find one, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a little bit selfish about it. So if I've put days or weeks or months or even years into finding this spot that works so well to photograph this thing, do I have to put it out there? Am I obligated to tell other people about it? And for me personally, I don't feel an obligation. I actually think it's a little bit more selfish for somebody who doesn't put in that work and doesn't put in that time. And believe me, it is an investment of time. For them to ask me for that location and expect me just to say, oh yeah, here you go. I don't know that that feels right to me. So again, am I being selfish about it? Maybe, but I also think you could look at it from the other side, which is it selfish for somebody who doesn't put in that work to ask for a spot that has taken a lot of time to acquire or hone? So something to think about there as well. And when you think about the uniqueness of a location, it's not just the physical location, but when a lot of people are shooting at the same spot. Imagine a scenario where there's a really nice subject, a really great action in an area, and you are now shoulder to shoulder to shoulder to, I mean, just a wall of people. And when that event starts or when that subject shows, all you hear is hundreds of thousands of clicks at the same time. How unique is your image? You've got a whole group of people doing the exact same thing that you're doing at the exact same time. And even if the event is special, or even if the action is really great, or even if the subject is really engaging, to me, personally, it just loses a lot when you just see the same thing that you just captured shared by everybody. So some photography circles are pretty small. And when you are doing something, and part of it for me is trying to get something that's a little different or a little bit unique. So when a location becomes so popular that there are just droves of people there, I do think it becomes very difficult to stand out or be unique or be different. And certainly the action may be interesting and it may be cool to capture, but somehow it tends to lose that sense of uniqueness when you're photographing with huge groups of people at the same time. Now, are there reasons to share locations? Absolutely. So I'm going to go through a couple of the reasons that I've gotten from people about why they think it's a good idea to share locations or why they do. The most being about getting other people involved and this idea of citizen science. So the more people that are involved, the more we can bring a perspective around nature and wildlife and conservation. And that is certainly a good thing. I don't know that it's the driving force behind why most people share stories on Facebook and Instagram or post their images. I think a lot of that has to do with immediate feedback and our innate desire to share everything about our lives. So let me give you some examples. I go to the movie and I post the movie that I've gone to. I drink bourbon at night, and there are times I'll post an Instagram story about the bourbon that I'm drinking. Now, nobody really cares. But in this environment of social media, we have this connection to a larger group. And sometimes we want to share what we're doing with that larger group. And I think that mindset is also put into our wildlife photography or our photos in general. So while it may not be a big deal if my family's at a scenic outlook and I'm going to share that location, it may be a bigger deal when I share the location of a sensitive owl species, or I share a location that not really a lot of people know about. And I say that this is a great spot to photograph. And all of a sudden, a lot more people are coming there. And again, perhaps damaging the environment or not being careful with the habitat. So why do we share? I think some of it does have to do with our desire to spread information and get others involved. But I also think there is this intrinsic desire that we have as humans just to connect with other people and put it out there. Now, my challenge is, can we share a pretty image without telling people where? And I think we can. So yes, let's get more people involved. Let's get more people interested, but let's also use some common sense about what we're sharing and the locations that we're sharing. Now, I'm going to put up here the list of pros and cons and just weigh it for yourself. So when you're sharing your images on social media, do you have to put the location down? Do you have to put it down every time? I have gone to very general locations, so I generally tag things with the state that I'm in, sometimes a county. But I don't really ever put a specific location anymore, and I'd like you just to consider the same. A couple other things can happen by sharing locations or sharing species. One other consideration while we're sharing is the timing around it, which I mentioned before, but also how do we caption it? So when we're posting an image on social media and we write up that description, could we be particular about not giving the location? So for example, undisclosed location, private location, or posting a very generic location like the state. And that will often dissuade people from asking. Again, it puts you in an uncomfortable position when people are asking you for locations that you may not want to share. So just consider that as well. So here's my list, pros and cons. I always challenge people when they're sharing locations. Why? What's in it? What's in it for you? What's in it for that species? What's in it for that location? Just weigh the pros and cons. And I think a lot of the times you're going to find that not sharing a location has more benefits than actually sharing it. So give it some attention, give it some thought. I'm really glad you tuned into the episode. I hope you liked the topic today. As always, I thank you for your continued support with the channel. I hope you will subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And if you didn't hit the like button for this one, hit the like button or dislike it. That's okay too. I would love to hear your comments. Some of you are going to agree with me and some of you are not going to agree with me. And that's okay too. So put it down in the comments and let's have some conversation around it. If you think that not sharing locations makes sense, maybe spread the word on social media as well. Politely challenge people or try to educate them about the pros and cons. And maybe we can convince some more people to protect the species, the habitat, and also protect their own intimacy and uniqueness of the images that they're producing. So once again, thank you for your continued support. Hope to see you out in the field soon. And I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.